Let's
do it.
I think so. Let's get going.
Sure. Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. We have almost 450 people joining us this evening on the call. I think we're going to have more when all's said and done. Welcome to tonight's discussion, which is Parenting in a Time of Crisis, featuring our good friends, Dr. Rob Evans and Dr. Michael Thompson. Both are astute observers of the social emotional dynamics that exist within the schoolhouse, and they're also certainly observers of what exists in the modern family unit as well. I'm confident that we're going to enjoy tonight's conversation and walk away feeling perhaps a little bit is, I would say, historic in many ways. It's a collaboration among our 5 Ontario independent schools. And I'm quite confident that in our combined 500 years of history, we have never co-hosted a parent meeting, and certainly not a Zoom meeting. So tonight is history. My name is Ed Kidd, and I am the headmaster at Ridley College. Tonight's moderator will be Mr. Innes Van Nostrand, who is principal at Appleby College. And concluding remarks and thanks will be offered by Mr. Sam McKinney, who's principal at Upper Canada College, and Mr. Kevin McHenry, headmaster at St. Andrew's College. In addition, I'd now like to welcome my co-host for this introduction, Miss Anne-Marie Key, who is head of school at Lakefield College School. Anne-Marie.
Thanks, Ed, and good evening, everyone. Michael Thompson and Rob Evans are both psychologists, authors, and consultants to schools. They have worked in hundreds of schools, including schools facing serious crises of all kinds, and in several dozen of the best schools in Canada. They have each written many articles, and Michael has published 9 books, Rob 3. During this COVID crisis, they have consulted with schools around the world. They asked me to specifically mention that they are both fathers and grandfathers, and that they have never murdered any of their offspring, though they've been tempted. Haven't we all? I would like to add one additional note. Not only have I read their books and heard them speak multiple times, but I have returned to their words of advice over and over again. These two are like head whisperers, and leaders and educators across the country are grateful for their tremendous influence on education over the past few decades. So thank you both for all of your impact. Tonight's presentation will be recorded, and I have 3 requests before we begin. I ask you to please stay on mute with your video off. Second, Rob and Michael will make time for our questions. So if you have a question, please use the chat box, and please get your questions in there right away so they can be prioritized. And third, I encourage you to view tonight's presentation on speaker's view rather than gallery view. Now over to you, Rob and Michael, and I can't wait.
Thanks, Anne-Marie.
Michael, that was lovely, Anne-Marie. Thank you.
Lovely. Maybe we should just go through that again, don't you think? Michael, I actually wouldn't mind seeing some faces. What do you think?
Are you going to contradict Anne-Marie? She made
No,
everybody.
I couldn't think so.
We do like to. Anybody wants to see their face seen? There, Kate Bell came right back on.
Yes.
She's going to.
We don't mind seeing some faces. That would
a
be
few faces. That helps us. Thank you.
So here's what we'd like to do. I want to share some what I think of as truly introductory remarks, because I want to hearken back to before the COVID crisis and set a little context, if I can, about how the challenges of parenting have loomed increasingly for people in North America. And Michael's going to be able to share some very specific things that we have heard from parents across the continent, actually, in our conversations with them over the last month or so. And then we're going to be eager to save a lot of time to hear your questions. And I'd like to underscore that if you've come here tonight with a question already in your head, please go right to the chat and put it in there. We may not have time to get to everything, but we will sure try. And it would be just great to know what you'd really love to hear about. So with that, let me just offer a little bit of context. prior to all this, it's hard to imagine now that it's only a couple of months, but prior to all this, it wasn't getting any easier to be a parent. I've thought for a long time that it's ironic that in a way we know more about child development than we ever have, but that it hasn't made it easier to be a parent. In part because the context within which parents are raising children has continued to change in ways that have made it so complex. Years ago, I asked myself, well, so what would it take to become a confident parent? And two things leapt out at me. The first is that you would need the rate of change around you to be slow and the choices for children to be few, because that might be the only way that I, as a parent, could be confident that what I know now is relevant to what my kids have to learn to grow up successfully, right? So let's say that the parts of Ontario served by your 5 schools were a primitive Stone Age fishing village in which the men fish and the women dry fish and salt the fish, right? The rate of change is glacially slow. The choices for children are non-existent. The certainty for adults is sky high. A boy has to learn to fish. A girl has to learn to dry and salt fish. The elders in the village can teach them both. We're set. Simplistic, you would say. Well, of course it is. Except it's not that far from how most humans have lived for most of human history, and many still do. We think how we raise children now on this continent is normal. But in any historical terms, it's way out on the far freakish end of human history because the rate of change has been accelerating steadily. If this were November, back in November, we never heard of COVID, and we were all in an auditorium together, I would have asked you how much of what's happening today was predictable to you 3 or 5 years ago. And the answer would have been very little. And that was before all of this, right? And also, what's also happened over the last several decades is that all the children in the best schools are supposed to be able to become anything they want and live anywhere they want and live any way they want. And the freedom and the opportunity are fabulous and unprecedented in human history. But the corresponding certainty for adults is lower, not higher. And that was before all this, I keep repeating. So that's a place where we be, for me, it's a sort of beginning point. Secondly, there's an additional challenge that's built into being a parent. And Michael and I know this both from raising our own children and from seeing our children raise their children. So here's the dilemma. I'm not a big believer in reading advice books about parenting, but one that I have liked has a wonderful title called All Joy and No Fun. And to me, it sort of summarizes parenting in many ways. Our children, excuse me, are the most precious things in our lives. We would die for them. We love them to death, as we say, and so on. But the actual business of raising them is actually not that rewarding. Now, I know, I see several of you right as I'm speaking, sipping wine, which I'm very glad about, and I'm sure you need at this point in the evening. But here's what I think about this. You know, just think about this. Your daughter, you snapped a photo of her blowing out the candles on her birthday cake when she was 7. She didn't have any teeth right up here. And it's just the sweetest thing. And your son mispronounced some word when he was 4. And your family has been deliberately mispronouncing it that way ever since because it's so endearing. The boy is 14. He could kill you, but you cannot resist because it's so charming. The reason these memories are so vivid for you is that they are so widely spaced. And in between them lie miles and miles, or kilometers and kilometers of space, right? I mean, you know, if you just think about what it's sort of mainly like, it's endless, mind-numbing tedium. Get them up, get them dressed, get them fed, get them out, pick them up, take them somewhere else, bring them back, get them fed, make them do homework if they're the right age, try to get them into bed, collapse exhausted. You know, in Scandinavia, where for decades, they have had extraordinarily generous parent benefits when a child is born, for fathers as well as for mothers. They still have to work to make the dads take it, because the fathers are smart enough to know that there's nothing you can get paid to do that isn't easier than spending all day with a small child. And I want to repeat, it's not that we don't love them. It's that it's a lot of work. And what we've had now for weeks is people trapped together. And has it provided wonderful opportunities for family togetherness? Yes, of course. Has it made people be just incredibly frustrated? Probably. And even those of you on this call tonight who are parents and are also teachers in school will know that it is easier always to teach someone else's child, almost always, than to teach one's own. When you're teaching someone, I see Anne Marie, look at her nodding her head. When you teach someone else's child, you have two things: devotion, that's what you get in your schools from the teachers, devotion, and distance. When you teach your own child, you have devotion and no distance. So we've had, Michael and I, chances to talk with parents all over the place who are doing their best, who are often very pleased at what the school has put together and how the school is handling things. But the younger the child, the harder it is to do a lot of online learning. I haven't forgotten this. A week ago, I'm talking to some teachers at a lower school, and the kindergarten teachers are describing trying to teach the kids. And one of them says, every morning, I try to have them in our circle. And there's one boy who comes right up to the camera like this. And there's another girl who during the first 20 minutes slowly slides out of the frame. And every now and then a mother appears in the screen out of the blue because she's been monitoring what I've been doing. So what I'm trying to say to you is this. There's a lot of normal, everything I've just said to you, there's a lot of normal tensions that we all have had to cope with and mostly work out fine, but have been put to the test during this time when there's been so much forced togetherness and so much deprivation of what we've normally depended on. I like to say to teachers when I get to talk to them, I say to teachers, you people think that what you do all day is normal, but no one else thinks that. Spending all day with 5-year-olds or 10-year-olds, or God forbid, 13-year-olds. This is most adults' idea of death. So we've been trapped in a way in all this. And what we'd like to do tonight is try to help untrap you a little. There are a number of fears and apprehensions that parents have had, which Michael's going to share some thoughts with you about, and then we'll be eager to take your questions. You're on, Michael.
So I've been in schools for 50 years. I'm 73, and I started as a middle school social studies teacher at the age of 23. And Rob and I have helped schools. We did after 9/11 and after the financial meltdown in 2008. I've reached back to my own boarding school days during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when I called my parents and said, what should I do if there's a nuclear attack? As if I would have had a lot of options, but I was 15 at the time. I've even gone back to when I was an elementary school boy in New York City and remember the polio epidemic. I was old enough to be a target of polio and was aware of my mother's fears and the fact that everybody was waiting for a vaccine. And I remember lining up at the Collegiate School for Boys in Manhattan in 1955 when I was 8 to get the shot. I can still have a picture in my mind of standing and getting that a vaccine. And Rob and I have seen a lot of trouble and scandal and tragedy in school. I have never seen anything like this. This combination of a lethal threat, enormous financial insecurity for schools and for parents and individual families and for teachers who don't know if they'll have a job. And this overwhelming uncertainty because there's nobody who can tell us what's going to happen. I mean, University of California colleges today announced that all 23 campuses would be teaching online in the fall, but The boys' school where I'm the supervising psychologist is very close to the decision saying, no, we are going to reopen in some way on the Danish model in the fall. We will be a brick and mortar school again. Who's right? Who knows? Who's got their finger out? Nobody knows. And then there's an enormous amount of grief. And that mixture, very powerful sadness for all of the things that we've lost, and many families have already lost family members, schools have lost staff and teachers. There's a lot to sort out and to feel. So what have parents asked Rob and me? What have been their number one concerns? Parents have been worried that their children were going to develop a mental illness, that they would be traumatized by this pandemic. And people have asked about my child's emotional well-being. Will she become anxious? Will he get depressed? We were talking to a bunch of folks from international schools, and one head of an international school said he was going to hire an additional counselor in the fall because so many kids would come back in need of counseling. And Rob and I said, no, that's not what we expect. We think children are resilient, and we think if children are with their parents and their parents are doing their best to keep the children safe, that ensures the mental health of most children. Children don't expect their parents to do miracles. They don't expect their parents to make this situation go away. What children need is to know that they are loved, to know that their parents are being honest with them, and to know that their parents are doing the best they can to keep their children safe, and the parents to keep themselves safe. And children who stayed in the London bombing, the Blitz in 39 and 40, did better in their mental health, even though they were in lethal danger, mortal danger every night from bombing. They did better staying with their parents than the children who were shipped out of London, away from their parents to keep them safe. So psychological safety is being with your parents and having them look after you, care for you. But they can't lie to you. I was talking to some parents in California who had a 4.5-year-old. Now, 4 to 4.5-year-olds developmentally are thinking about death and realizing that death is permanent. And the parents wanted to keep from her that there was any mortal threat. And they were saying to me they were worried their daughter was mentally ill because she was obsessed. She was asking, can people die from this? Can people die from this? They were telling her that these masks that people were wearing was kind of like a carnival thing. Well, she was not buying it at all. And she kept going after them. And, she deserves a straight answer, not a voluminous answer, not paragraphs, but she's divined the truth, and you have to be straightforward with kids. So you do the best to tell your kids that you're going to keep them as safe as you possibly can. They see that you've changed your way of life and everything, and you're washing your hands like a maniac and asking them to wash their hands. They get it. And there will be some children who were fragile going into this. There are some children who've had anxiety disorders, children who've been depressed. And you have to watch those children. And some children have ramped up in their anxieties. I've talked to parents where they had a 9-year-old girl with some obsessive compulsive stuff, and having an unseen virus anywhere is enough to drive an obsessive compulsive kid pretty batty. And there will be kids who need some attention, but mostly not. That won't be a surprise. What isn't a depression is your 16-year-old storming around the house saying he feels trapped, there's no hope, and he's stuck, and he's storming this way and that way. That's not the beginning of depression. That's an angry 16-year-old. And if you got an angry 16-year-old, wait a day. We don't diagnose depressions unless they are sustained over time, a feeling of intense sadness, hopelessness, and futility But an angry expression of it one day is not enough. That's a Belmont Hill parent who brought me that case, afraid that her son was getting depressed. The second question that parents have been throwing is, what do I do with, are our children going to suffer from not having their peers, not having their friends, and their social life of school? Is that going to be a deprivation? Sure, it is. They're going to miss it. Is it going, again, to be traumatic? Are they going to miss out on something serious? Well, first of all, kids 11 and up are online or on multiplayer video games. They've got smartphones. They're communicating in the way that they always have. Well, what about the younger kids? It doesn't work as well for them. Parents say to me, I've been getting my 6-year-old son on Zoom conferences with his friend, and they just sit there and look at each other. Because in fact, 6-year-olds are not great conversationalists. They're great playmates. They see each other and they start to run and do something together, they have an activity together. Sitting on a screen and looking at another 6-year-old is not going to be that gratifying. So they're not going to continue to do it. And a frantic parent who thinks that they're providing a social life by doing this, well, I hope you've already been persuaded out of it by your child's disinterest. What your younger children are going to look around for is a sibling. And I think siblings are going to get closer. They're going to have more better times together, and they're going to have more fights because they're spending more time together. And it's going to be more intense relationship. But Rob and I have already been getting stories about sibships that are really kind of pulling together. And besides, they have a natural enemy, which is their exasperated parents. And so they know when to withdraw from the exasperated parents, and they know when to be with the exasperated parents. But they're providing a lot of play with each other. So then parents say, well, what about the only child? What do we do about the only child? Well, she's missing her society. And I know I'm going to sound just like a slacker psychologist who can't get worried about anything, but only children, their life has been mostly being doted upon by 2 adults who loved to look after them, care for them, talk with them, and spend time with them. And only children are quite used to adult company. So even though they miss their friends, this is actually their ground of existence. This is their default position, being with their parents, and they're prepared to do it for a while. I do not think that kids are going to necessarily be hurt by the lack of their friendships. What they are going to be is bored and grouchy. And they are going to be bored and grouchy. And you'll just have to bear it, because actually we're kind of bored and grouchy too. Am I just speaking for myself here? So, am I the only?
Certainly not for me. I'm not remotely grouchy.
Right. So I want to answer one more question that people have been throwing at us. Most parents have relaxed the rules about screens. And the parents who are real purists and really limited the screen time of their kids it's now Liberty All. And parents are saying to me, they're so guilty and self-reproaching. And I say, are your children in front of screens so you can get some work done? Because you're trying to run a business or you're trying to do your job. Yeah. But what's going to happen? Are they going to be addicted? Most children know that this is an emergency situation. This is an emergency situation. This isn't homeschooling that parents prepared to do, nor is it actually online learning the teacher's prepared to do. This is emergency distance online learning with 3 moving constituencies, all trying to do their very best. Parents, teachers, and kids. And if there's more screen time, well, so be it. What you need is not to let your 14-year-old son, who's been playing video games up to 11, move it to 12, and then to 1 a.m. and then to 2 a.m. They will push. Teenagers will push, and their sleep will get disrupted, and then you'll have a sleep deprived and cranky kid. No, you've got to keep some schedule in place, and maybe you have to turn the server off at a certain point, and that won't make you popular. But I do not believe we're going to come out of this with a whole group of kids who will go back to the old regime, or who will be addicted to screens. So those are the three things I wanted to address that have been thrown Robs in my way. Now, Ines, have you been curating some questions for us? You got to unmute yourself.
Ines, you got to unmute.
I know I'm unmuted. I'm unmuted.
Sorry to sound so
Back
accusing.
off, you back
Sorry.
off.
We don't get to
But
order.
do your job here.
We don't get to order school heads around that much, so we'd like to take the chance that we can.
Listen, those were incredible intro remarks, and thank you very much. We've got dozens and dozens of questions. I want to start off with one of the early ones by a parent. A number of people said ditto, ditto, ditto. And she talked about how her daughter was has been passionate about competitive dancing, but since a lockdown situation, she started not to be participating in Zoom calls, in schoolwork, and has said she doesn't want to do anything further around competitive dance moving forward, and really disconnecting. And I guess that's the general question about kids starting to disconnect from a variety of things, and how to deal with that.
There are kids who, to exercise some power in a helpless situation, will go on strike. And it's a natural kid reaction, which is, I don't have any other power except a kind of negative power. So I say, screw this, I hate this, don't want to do this, won't do it, sorry, not doing it. And it will make parents frantic. But it's an expression of a situational futility. I don't think parents should take it as a valid expression of what the child's going to feel in 3 months. Rob?
So I would agree. There are, I don't know, it's always, Ines, it's always tricky to answer questions because you don't know all the details. I think maybe we won't take any more. Thank you very much. But so without knowing the details here, one thing that has come up sometimes, there are these days, it has to be said, many children who are involved in a lot of activities because parents want them to be, but not necessarily because the child loves it. Or the child has loved it for a while, but it has begun to pall. And then this situation has somehow brought that to a head. So that's a possibility. But I'm mostly with Michael about this. I don't want to draw too many conclusions from right now. And depending on the age of the child and the personality of the child and the mood and how things are going at the moment, sometimes, kids, they just have this capacity to hit that button, and it gets you right in the place where you cringe and you feel you have to fix it, and it can't be this way, and you want to talk them out of it and so on. It's always easier to say this about other people's children than it was when they were my own. But if I could stand it, I would be inclined not to get into a lot of back and forth. Oh, yes, you should. This will be good for you. You've always loved it. What's the matter? I would be more inclined to want to say, gee, something seems to have changed. What's up? And I'd listen to a little, and I'd probably say, gosh, well, I guess that's something you'll have to think about when this is all over. And if I could manage it, I'd low key it instead of high keying it. Because I don't want to provoke something here if it's what Michael just sort of gave an example of what it is. Now,
Like her, when she sees her competitive dance friends, she may get a surge of interest, boom, just like that.
Yep.
Another question that's gotten a fair number of dittos beside it is around siblings at home, an elevated degree of fighting.
I love this question.
Battles.
Yeah, well,
we feel like we're constantly playing referee. So
No,
Thank
no,
you.
no, no.
I love this question. Having written books on boys, I get variations on this question all the time about a 9-year-old boy and a 7-year-old boy, and they fight and they fight and they fight endlessly, and they're endlessly competing and blah, blah, blah. Sometimes I ask parents to mentally take a stopwatch and time how much positive time or just neutral time, for instance, watching TV together, there is as compared to fighting time, and give me a ratio. It's generally 5-to-1 positive and neutral time to fighting time. It's that the fighting time is unpleasant and it aggravates the parent and they want it to stop. But it is maybe only 15-20% of the interaction between the kids. Look, I referred to this earlier. They're going to be more intense sibling relationships because that's their whole society right now. So when I'm asked the question about, let's say, a 9-year-old and a 7-year-old boy, this is what I ask a parent. I say, are they relatively well matched in weight and height? No, the 9-year-old's bigger, but not that much bigger. I say, well, that's good. Does the 7-year-old start fights with the 9-year-old, knowing that that's going to result in a battle of, yes, the younger one starts fights. So the younger one isn't completely psychologically dominated and oppressed. No, the younger one gets in her licks or his licks. I say, have there been any broken bones? Have there been broken teeth? Has there been blood? Have there been stitches? No. I say, you're good to go. Absolutely good to go. You know that you have 2 kids who have pulled their punches, literally, and the older one certainly has, because he or she has not hurt the younger one. What you need to do is wish them, when they start to fight, it starts to aggravate you, you leave the room and you wish them the best. And you don't get pulled into this to become Judge Judy, because kids love to pull a parent into the fight.
That's what it's all about.
Yeah, it's what it's all about. And let's see who we can get mom to come on, whose side you come down on,
Right.
And you'll never get it right.
So one thing, if it really has happened more than you want and you can't stand it, if you can manage it, what's really good to do is actually to wet blanket it. It's not always possible when you feel revved up. You say, I don't believe we're doing this again. You know what? Just go to your rooms, whatever. Enough already. What you don't want to do is rev it up and get into it with them and try to play. You said Judge Judy. I always thought of Solomon. Whatever. I mean, it's a loser's game to do that. It's just better to say, go. And the younger one will say, well, he picks up, and the older one, who's always in the right, all of us firstborns know that, will say, the little pipsqueak started it just so that I, to try to get me in trouble. There's no way you win this. It's easy to be someone else's outside advisor like this and say what we're saying, but we can guarantee you that this actually works a huge amount of the time. Go, we're done. No, I'm not interested. I don't care. I don't want to know who started it. It is really, really boring. It's the 3rd time today. It's so tedious when you just go. And
I had a fellow in Connecticut who said his mother used to tell him and his brother, when she'd get fed up, she'd say, oh, go outside and throw rocks at each other. And they'd look at each other. She can't really mean that, right? But that's what she always said. And they knew that was her breaking point. She was advising them to go outside and throw rocks at each other.
Yeah. So when you're done,
wise comment about firstborns, Rob. Thank you.
Yes.
I'd also, there's a great question here that actually combines 2 different streams, I think. It's around, from a parenting standpoint, is it okay to show disappointment and emotion, i.e. including an occasional tear, to our child in grade 12 because the missing graduation or proms, so there's 2 thoughts here. One is around the milestone, and the other one is the degree of emotion that parents are showing, especially in a time of uncertainty, unease, and worry that kids may have. So 2 different themes there.
Let me take a first crack, and Michael can add to it. So the first thing is the whole business of losing graduation is certainly meaningful to all the graduates who would normally have the traditional ceremony. but it's also powerfully meaningful to parents. And Michael and I have heard this, right, Michael, on virtually every call. And with many, many heads of school in us have told us, it seems like the parents of our graduates are even more upset than the students are. And the graduation is loaded with meaning, not just for the students or for the teachers and the administrators, I mean, for everybody. But for parents, it has a couple of things. It's always been a little bittersweet, because on the one hand, you have this wonderful sense of achievement, and you paid all this money all these years, and the child has actually finished up and is heading on to the future, right? On the other hand, having a child graduate is not a sign that you're getting younger. And it's also a sign that the child will be leaving and not a child anymore. And for many, many, many adults, I speak about this personally, for many of us, having your kids go through adolescence and especially then graduate can drag you back through your own. And you remember some things pretty vividly from back then. So for lots of parents, there's a heavy loading in us in a way about all of this. And if a parent is a little sad about this and says something about it or sheds a tear, you know, as long as you're not weeping daily, I mean, this is not going to necessarily do damage to a graduating student at all, you know. On the other hand, it's also true that everybody, Michael, you heard him in the beginning talk about grief. Everybody has lost something here. Michael and I have heard from tons of administrators and teachers about how sad they feel about losing all this, losing their direct contact with the students, the graduation, all that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of loss for everyone. And Michael and I are believers that there's no point in pretending otherwise. You don't have to wallow in it daily, 24/7, but there's no reason, right, Michael, not to acknowledge that it's a loss.
Oh, you must, you name it and acknowledge it. But what you don't want is to be a lot sadder than your senior is, because you're implying that she's having or he's having a traumatic loss that you can see that she can't. Your feelings get bigger than his or hers. And we had a head of a girls' school in Cleveland say, I'm a little annoyed because the mothers are so out in front with their grief. It's as if they don't see their own daughter's resilience. You don't want to grieve in a way that makes your kids think that they can't handle it, because they can handle it. They will find a way to handle it. It's not ideal and it's sad, but they'll handle it.
Right. That's a really nice summary. They will handle it.
So this question spins off some of the things you're talking about earlier. It's interesting. It says, how can we provide guidance to our children on what the world will look like when we're as in the dark as they are? We're used to leveraging our own experiences to inform our conversations and guidance. But now the playbook is out the window. How do we help them navigate?
So, first of all, I wasn't clear how I might have helped my children navigate before all this, let alone with all this in us. So I think there is a question here. I don't know if I'm misunderstanding this, so Michael, catch me up on this. But I mean, I'm not sure that that's a parent's job. Depending on the age of the child, I would want to engage with the child about a question they had. What do you think is going to happen? Gee, what's it going to be like after we're not wearing masks anymore? When do you think school will start? What happens if there's no regular school next year? But in all these things, Ines, I would be wanting to say to a child, if they have a question, what were you thinking? Or what made you ask? And what I'd want to do is engage them and hear from them a little. I don't feel it's actually necessarily helpful to children to try to give them a forecast or explain the future to them in the absence of them bringing a question to you. If a mother and father or partners are talking about something about this, the future or whatever, and the child asks a question, okay. But as a general rule, first of all, I don't know how you'd be able to explain much about this because we don't know, as Michael said earlier. But I actually don't think necessarily that's a key thing for parents to have to do, period, and certainly not in this context. Yes, Michael? No, what?
I know. I want you to ask the child, I think you said it, Rob. You ask the child what he or she thinks, what they're worried about, what they're concerned about. They're parents who hold themselves to a standard of sort of being able to see the clear pathway for the child going forward. And Rob and I have never thought that parents can always do that. And the ones who try too hard, that's not great for their kids. I want, Ines, did you see one go by about how do you motivate a child to attend an online class? May I grab that one?
Yeah, and in fact, there are a whole bunch around that, including procrastinators, and the summatives are coming out.
Right.
How do I
So
help my child focus and motivate?
I somehow believe that the high school kid is a boy. That's my guess, because the whole pattern of the lectures are asynchronous, and he can watch them later, and so he keeps putting it off. He kicks the can down the road. That sounds more like boy behavior. It inspires me to tell a story. I was watching once at Ridley College in South London, a very famous boys' school that produced among their old boys, as they call them, Ernest Shackleton and P.G. Wodehouse. So the standards are fairly high for what you have to do, given that Shackleton's boat is in the front lobby of the school. And I was hearing the headmaster, he was on the, I wish I could remember his name, wonderful man, on the edge of retirement, but he was scolding the boys because they hadn't done well on the practice A-levels. And he felt they hadn't made an effort, and they waited till the last minute, and they hadn't prepared, and he was going at him. And as I listened to this whole thing, and I said, I could tell he'd given the lecture probably annually. And I said to him, what is it about boys? Why do they procrastinate? Why do they delay their work? What is it? You've worked with boys your whole career. What's that about? And he said to me, well, a boy is always imagining that the school might burn down or his teacher might die. And he wouldn't have wanted to do the homework for that to happen. Well, I roared the way Rob was. I just thought it was so hysterical. And the thing is, there are a lot of boys right now where their dream that the school's burned down and the teacher might die, we're very close to that situation. This thing they've been hoping for would get them off the hook. Maybe this is it. Who knows? So you wouldn't want to leap out of bed in the morning and get into your first online class if it could be later, because who knows? Maybe I won't be held responsible for it. So I'm getting a ton of stories about middle school boys and small boys gaming this, doing the absolute minimum. And I had a very upset mother at Belmont Hill who said about her senior son, she said he's hitting the snooze alarm, he's not making his first class, he seems to be letting his grade in math drop, and he doesn't seem motivated. Dr. Thompson, I'm very worried. And I said, well, I've been at Belmont Hill for 25 years, and I've seen seniors do that every year. It's just that you as a parent are getting to see it close up. And we've seen senior spring or senioritis and a lack of motivation in seniors. That's an old story to us. Actually, parents are seeing things by spending all day with their learners and seeing how unfocused they are at times and how avoidant the path is for some of them. And in a way that wouldn't be so shocking to teachers. I think mostly teachers have to hold kids accountable, even if it is on the screen. I really believe that for a teenager, the accountability has to be to themselves and to the teacher.
So here's just a postscript to that. There's no way to pretend, no matter how well. We've heard evidence repeatedly over the last couple of weeks. We've heard from heads all over the US and actually some from Canada as well and some internationally, how pleased they are with what their teachers have done to gear up and be able to deliver the online instruction. But I don't think there's any way that anybody thinks this is ideal and this is what we'd like to do for the future, and it captures everything we'd aspire to. So it's probably fair to say that in most places, the kids won't be at least covering as much and perhaps not learning some stuff as deeply as they otherwise would have. However, this is a very big however. The students who populate your schools, your 5 schools, are of a particular kind. The fact that they're even in these schools tells you something important about their capacities. And there was a wonderful head of the New York Association of Independent Schools for many years named Fred Calder, the former headmaster himself, who used to say that the kids in the top US independent schools, he'd say, you can't keep them from learning no matter who you put at the front of the room. And he didn't mean they shouldn't have good teachers. He meant they're the kind of students who actually underneath have a motivation and come from households where parents have a motivation and where parents are modeling something important about learning. And I think there are a lot of kids right now who haven't necessarily been what parents would see as absolutely top-notch all the time, who are actually not likely to be suffering significant educational deficits as a result of this, and who are likely to recoup pretty rapidly any lost ground they'd have to make up. There are many students in many schools, particularly in the US, particular example in poor urban areas, where this is not the case at all. It's a very different picture there. But for the kids in your schools, I'd be very surprised actually if there were substantial deficits building as a result of this that would somehow penalize them down the road.
So Michael and Rob, I've had 2 questions posed privately around tricky family situations. So one, we're in a family where the parents are recently separated in different homes, and the kids are becoming more adamant about wanting to be in one house more than the other, and the parents trying to figure out, do we handle that differently? And then a related but different question around some single parent challenges, and kind of heightened anxiety, or at least the view that there may be some heightened concerns. So thoughts on those kinds of situations?
Well, COVID rules everything. So you can't do anything that is unsafe. But to the extent that you have 2 homes and they have both been effectively quarantined, and you have 2 parents and there has been a recent separation or divorce, and kids want to go to the other home. We don't know the age of the children. I have so many questions here, but I have to answer it briefly and quickly. Consistent with good public health and the threat of this virus, the kids should be able to see both parents and move between houses if that's possible. There are issues of favoring one parent over the other, and that gets into divorce stuff, and it's too complex for me to address simply.
What were you going to say, Ines?
Well, I think Michael just dealt with that one, which
Okay.
was a case of still safe, but where the kids are starting to exert preference for being one place more than the other.
Right.
And, yeah.
So in terms of the single parenting side of it, so what this makes is, I'm very glad that you actually brought these forward, because as everybody who's been on this call with us will have heard, we've been saying essentially that there's lots of reason to trust the resilience of children, that lots of things are challenging but actually can work out. And we've been urging people not to be overreactive in terms of concerns and worries, et cetera. But it's also true, and I think it needs to be acknowledged up front, there are situations that are just plain challenging if we didn't have COVID, and that can be more when we do. So, it's almost never easy being a single parent. And it's certainly not easy if you're trapped altogether in some ways. And depending on how many children there are and their ages and the dynamics inside the family unit and so on, it can be very difficult. And it would be, I think, dishonest if Michael and I were to pretend that, oh, there's nothing to this, it's just going to be fine. There are a couple things that do occur to me. First, the same things are generally true that we have said, that most kids are mostly resilient, all children have fragile moments, and some kids are truly fragile, but most are mostly resilient. Secondly, what's especially hard very often, among other things, about being a single parent is being the single part, alone with the parenting, which can be so challenging. If there's any way that somebody has a connection to someone else, another parent, not necessarily another single parent even, but someone else to talk to about this and to be able to sort of tell some stories and troubleshoot a little, to be less alone with it can be very helpful. And whether there's a single parent or not, if a parent has for any reason a significant concern about a child, and I'm going to tell you how I define that. Significant concern would be a change in the child's basic pattern of behavior or the sibling's basic pattern of behavior that isn't just a couple of days or every now and then. You have somebody who's off, not sleeping for a week. You have somebody whose appetite is off, a child or whatever. You have kids who are at each other in a way they haven't been before. I would very much wish that that parent would contact someone at your school. I'm guessing, Ines, that all 5 schools here would have personnel who would be able to be helpful about this and could connect the parent to resources. Wouldn't that be true?
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
So if any parent on this call, whether single or not, has a concern that feels like it's just piling up to be more than he or she can manage, it would be good to reach out.
And it doesn't, a counselor, it's important to know they're there. But if you are a single parent and you need a break and you have a 9-year-old, maybe you have a friend with a 14-year-old in her house, and that 14-year-old could come online and do a little homework work with the 9-year-old. A child doesn't always need a therapist. Another older child, a family friend who appears regularly and gives the parent and child, if it's a single parent with one child, that dyad needs a break.
Yep.
And introducing somebody else into the mix, introducing a grandparent into the mix. I'm doing that for my daughter's children, and so is my wife from time to time. We can give them a break by coming on and reading. So reach out for those resources. That can help. And an older child who's not that interested in her younger brother can be incentivized with money to pay more attention. You know, a 12-year-old girl to a 7-year-old boy whom she wouldn't normally have much time for. But you can, right? You can make a little money on the side in a pandemic.
I think my wife is trying to incentivize me to spend time with our kids too. So there's a question from a friend of mine, and we see this in my own family right now, where your kids, especially older high school kids, maybe some of those in college, may really doubt that there's a significant threat to them. And so from a parenting standpoint, if they see their kids starting to engage in what could be dangerous behavior and they don't buy into it, and I think in the Ontario context, while we've had issues, my guess is many families on the line don't know of people who have actually been really sick with COVID. And so there's this kind of idea out there, but it's more theoretical in many cases, and young people doubting that. So any thoughts on that issue?
Well, late adolescents and young adults think they're immortal anyway. That's part of their psychology. It's maddening. But if there's nobody around, I'm in a town that's had 23 people die and over 400 cases in a town of 28,000. So it feels close and real. And yet when I go out for a walk during the day, I see teens and they're not social distancing and they are casual. It's because they think they're immortal. And parents have to do the best they can to yell at them and tell them and warn them and share the information. They're up against the teenage immortality, and all you have to, you do have to remember in your most desperate moments that 95% of the people who've died of COVID-19 have been over the age of 55. And the young are relatively protected against this virus. And some of them know that, And so it's not just their delusional sense of immortality, it's their take on the risk.
And it's not just the immortality, though God knows that's true. There's also the hormones. You know, if you've been away from your girlfriend or boyfriend for 6 or 7 or 8 weeks, it's not that appealing to wear a mask when you finally see her or him. And so there's a lot of stuff here that's just what Michael's saying. It's built into sort of adolescence. There is a case to be made here, I have to say this, for holding the line in a big way about anything that really turns your stomach. And me, I'm likely to skip the explanation. So I'm happy to say, you can't be doing this without a mask or whatever. And they could say why. I'll explain it once, maybe twice. After that, I'm done. If that's not good enough, they're staying home. They don't like it. Tough. Now, not everybody chooses to do it that way, and that's okay. Every family can do it their own way. But what's not helpful is to engage in a lengthy back and forth with adolescents who are training to be lawyers and who want to split hairs and pit nits and argue small points and point out your inconsistencies and all this kind of stuff. It's much easier to say, I'm sorry, I know you think I'm an idiot. This is it. There's 2 choices. Either you go out this way or you don't go out. And so for me, anyway, there are places where I would surely cut kids slack, depending on the circumstance and whatnot, and other places where I wouldn't. And in the places where I wouldn't, I'd be willing to take the hit, and they can go say to their friends, you know, my dad, he's awful. Or my mom, she's just awful. Big deal.
In our case, it's more of the same. So there are a few questions.
Consistently awful.
There's a few questions about degree of structure and freedom. And Michael, you talked about this before with respect to screen time. There's some families making plans for summer and wondering whether they should program a whole bunch of stuff tied to online courses or other programs, or provide much more freedom for kids who often are inclined to want to do that. Any sense of general advice one way or the other, or is it all kind of dependent on?
I can't see the summer clearly. The problem with planning is that I can't see, you know, and as we're talking earlier about my involvement with camps, but the camp people don't know. They're hoping for, in the States, for a testing miracle, which isn't being produced. They're hoping for CDC guidelines. Everybody's immobilized and hoping that they'd be able to provide more for kids. I think it's very hard to be this helpless, and I think it's people who are accustomed to planning for the future for themselves and their kids are finding this wildly uncomfortable. But I think we don't know yet what's going to be safe and what's going to be available.
Second, I think it's also true, Ines, that being able to do the stuff online has in one way been a godsend. And in another way, it's wearing. So all of the school heads who are here tonight, for example, you think about how much of your time, Ed, for example, is spent online doing something like this, looking at people in little boxes and so on. And on the one hand, it's amazing because you can meet and plan and do stuff. And on the other, it's tiring. And it's often much more tiring than sitting face to face in a room with 8 people or 10 or 15 people or whatever. There are pieces of it which are not that riveting. And on the one hand, I can easily see why a parent would think, well, what's my child going to do all summer? Right? That's a fair thing to wonder about. On the other, the idea for many kids, and perhaps not all, but to spend the rest of the summer doing what you've been doing for the last 6 weeks is probably not going to electrify them. And it's not, it may be that there are little bits of something that would be really good and that are very well done. So, for example, I have a daughter-in-law who runs day camps for young children in the Washington, D.C. area, and she's now developed a whole bunch of kits that parents can use at home with their kids because they're not going to be coming to the camp and so on. So there may be a variety of substitutes that are actually quite good and that work out very well for people, and necessity becomes the mother of invention. But I don't think it's as hard as it would be to imagine a summer without structure altogether. I'm also hard pressed to imagine for lots of kids, especially teenagers, a summer loaded with more course type stuff delivered.
They'll be wiped out for the fall.
Yeah,
they'll be wiped out for the fall. I think this is, as much as possible, I hope people will find a way to get into the out of doors, get their children in the out of doors, get out the tent and the sleeping bags. It's a good social distancing.
And also, when you said in this, because Ontario is not like New York City, and you haven't had that same experience, and you may have many more options available to you this summer, precisely because you haven't suffered that extent of loss and death and so on.
When is Ontario opening? Can we ask when's Ontario opening up? Do you have an opening up date or beginning opening up?
No, there's talk about it. There's rumblings that maybe a little bit of easing may happen in the next couple of weeks, but it's still really unclear.
Yep.
Who knows? But on the subject of tragedy or grieving, and there was a question came through privately, and I'm not sure it's COVID related, except it's the idea of grieving remotely. So having a grandparent who's passing away, and how do you handle that within a family with kids, and those conversations where you can't necessarily be with that person, and any suggestions about that?
It's a great question. I would say, from one point of view, it's not that different from if you weren't remotely, depending on the age of the children, depending on their closeness to the grandparent, for example, you'd have a different reaction. The closer to the grandparent, the more the loss would register for the child, the more important it would be to be able to acknowledge it and to be able to share the feelings and to listen to them and all of that kind of, just as you would do in person. It's analogous to a graduation in a way that it wouldn't be the same to have someone die, say, and not to be able to attend a funeral, or to have to put it off and have a memorial service later, or whatever that might be. But the basics would still be the same, that if we lose somebody, we need some chance to be able to share what we've lost and to acknowledge the grief together. And even if we can't be together and hug and hold one another, we can be as together as we can be and look forward to the time when we'd be able to do that. I wouldn't.
Children can write.
Yes.
Children can send poems. Children can put together music that's meaningful to them.
Yep.
And send it to a grieving relative or play it. A family can do a little ceremony, a memorial ceremony. Mexican Day of the Dead has taught me a lot, because I've gone to schools in Texas and New Mexico, where part of the art projects for the kids in the school is to make up a little altar with the grandparents, with the late grandparents. And I've seen children, fourth graders and fifth graders, do beautiful, beautiful memorials to their grandparents. We have to give children's creativity an outlet so they can grieve through their art, using art. We're going to have to go at some point, huh?
Yeah, we're down to about 3 more minutes, I think. Is that good for you?
We're good.
Yeah. So there's a number of questions. You kind of talked about this around milestones, but thinking more broadly around transitions. So people are talking about their kids, wondering about university, and should I've got a child who wants to take a gap year, and no one knows what universities are going to be doing in the fall, and that whole managing the transition question with your children, and whether there's kind of any insights or guidance around that, because in addition to the regular worry about a massive change, now all of a sudden it's into, I don't know what.
We don't know either.
You ask 18-year-olds, how are you going to handle this? How do you think you're going to deal with it? What do you think? An 18-year-old who's going to transition, the question you need to ask is, you need to ask them what they see and how they, and the kind of scenario they're constructing for themselves, because they're going to have to live it. So that's your starting place, and you let them take the lead in it, because we can't arrange the transition, but by its very nature.
And we may know a lot more in a month than we know now, in terms of what the options are going to be in this, and so I think one of the challenges is this would normally be a time when families would be sure about what's happening next. And the trouble is that we're not sure, and we don't have that kind of control, and it's very frustrating and unnerving to have to wait and see. But I'm with Michael. I'm a big believer in, we're all up against it. We're all having to sort of figure this out. What are you thinking? And I don't want to pepper a student with endless questions. What are you thinking? What are you thinking? What are you thinking? Day after day. But if we're having a conversation, I'd like to be able to ask, because it's always good to know. They say, gee, I have no idea. I don't know what's going to happen. You say, well, I don't either. What are you thinking? What might be? Well, we kick it back and forth, and maybe we need to talk again in a couple of weeks when we see if there's any more word from the universities about what they're doing, for example, and that sort of thing. But this is another example of the enormous, Michael talked about it right at the beginning, the enormous uncertainty of all this. It'd be one thing if it were just lethal and economically damaging. It's another thing for it to be so uncertain, as well as those two.
So with apologies to everyone on the line who's asked many questions, I'm just going to finish with a quick one, more positive. So what are some specific tips or exercises you might recommend to reinforce optimism in communicating with kids? Nobody has a crystal ball or a clear line of sight, but how do you open up kids to the idea that in the grander scheme of things, everything will most likely be all right?
They know that. They know that. That's in them. You don't have to be constantly boosting your children's mood. Watch them. They find moments of joy and happiness. They get on their games with their friends, and they come away having played and with the natural energy that arises out of that. They will find their optimism. I don't think you have to pump kids full of optimism.
Here's the second part of it. Children always have been and will be doing what everyone on this call did growing up. We learn much more from the example our parents set than from the sermons they preach. The sermons are not unimportant. If the student is about to graduate, she has heard every one of your sermons, except possibly the one before you go to university. And you may find yourself repeating them endlessly. Okay, there's no harm done. But the real lessons that we learn are from the examples that our parents set, not from the sermons they preach. So if your approach to all this models some version of realistic assessment of the danger and a kind of upward-looking effort to make sure we're going to be safe and do as well as we can, it's likely that that's what your children will, imbibe from you. And I would spend very little time trying to pump them, and much more time if I were going to bother thinking about what example we're setting. I can tell you this, it doesn't make any sense to be sitting at the dinner table all together and for the parents to be talking in glum terms about how awful this is, and then try to give the kids a little pep talk at bedtime, right? Save the glum talk for when you're at bedtime, and just, if you can do it, but what you model is likely going to be what they're going to learn most from.
Great. Listen, I'm going to pass it over to my friends, Kevin from St. Andrews and Sam from Upper Canada, but you guys are great heads whisperers, as Anne-Marie said, and every time I think you're really a pair of Yodas for heads, and I hear you talk about kids, and I realize that's an even sweeter spot for you. So I appreciate it. Kevin and Sam, over to you guys.
Thanks very much, Innes. And look, I think we've all benefited on the call this evening from the decades of experience that Rob and Michael have shared. The comments coming in will say thank you far better than Kevin and I might. But The heads whisperer comment certainly rings true for me. I had the pleasure of two days with Rob and Michael last year in April, and as we've all experienced on the call tonight, I'm sure you can picture the benefit that that has done to me. Thank you very much, Rob and Michael. To the parents who are on the call, this call has been recorded, or the meeting has been recorded and will be shared. So please look forward to that if there's anything that you wish to review. And just to reiterate the point that Rob and Michael made about reaching out to our schools for support. We are here. We have effective services within the school that are available to you at this time and through this time. And let's look forward to the opportunity when we're back gathering on site again. Kevin?
Yeah, I'd just like to echo Sam's comments and Ines' comments. These are two legendary figures, and I think you can see that from the last hour or so. Certainly both gentlemen have great websites. They are highly respected authors. I know that Sam and I, as heads of boys' school, Michael's written It's a Boy, and speaking of boys, they're right on the first shelf of my bookcase. I really like the comment, it's very hard to be helpless. And finally, again, a sincere thank you to both of you and to all the parents who have taken time on this Wednesday evening to listen to these two very insightful speakers. And I want to thank you very much for giving us permission to allow our kids to fight. So we'll let them go at it, and all will be well. So thank you so much.
Oh,
Thank you all.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob and Michael, and thanks all.
Stay healthy.
Stay safe.
Stay healthy and safe. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for attending.